Bruce, I just said as a little introduction to you, obviously you are CEO of Twitter in EMEA, but you have written this amazing book. And I said that if I could have written a book, this actually would be the one. Sadly, I'm not able to do that. Tell me about the key themes in your book.
I'm convinced that the whole of modern work is a lie. And that's the start point. Basically, we've got this remarkable situation that we've all created. The whole of modern, half of people who work in offices report feeling burnt out. And we've engineered the way that work has been constructed now, it's almost like, we spend time, certainly in my job, I spend time hearing about the subversion of things and people hacking things. But it's almost like someone has hacked work. The average Brit spends 2 days a week in meetings, we get 140 emails a day. We stumble from those meetings into an open plan office where we can't get anything done because the woman behind is talking about last night's Baptiste. And we're constantly in a zone where we can't get things done. And actually, there's a remarkable, the lies permeate everything about modern work. If someone said, we spend 2 days a week in meetings, for managers it's 3 days a week in meetings. But if someone said a child's brain was transported into ours and they saw what happened in those meetings, they'd say, you spend 3 days a week in meetings pretending to pay attention. And we've created the operating system of modern work is people pretending to be interested and then stumbling, stressed, back to their desk, to the extent that the average working day has gone up by 2 hours a day since the email landed on our phone. People who check their emails for 2 hours a day outside of work, half of those people report being in the very highest quintile of stress. So we've just created this operating system of modern work that's permeated with misdirection and lies. And the tragedy of it is that everyone who enters work can see how broken this is, can see how this is no way for sentient adults to live. And yet gradually we force them to submit into the way that we've constructed work. So I sort of started this, I started from a perspective, I work at Twitter, and I was observing people around me become dead-eyed and sort of weary with work. and like, the thing is, I'd previously worked there and people looked happy, they'd skip to work, people looked sort of happy, and I'd taken credit for that. And I thought, if I've taken credit for the good stuff, I have to take credit for the bad stuff. And I found myself researching workplace psychology, and what you're presented with each successive paper you read, each academic you speak to, this sort of a realisation, why does none of this reach people in work? The science of open plan offices, I mentioned before, but the science of open plan offices is face-to-face interactions go down by 75%, and emails go up by 2/3. The single thing that open plan offices always accomplish is that they end up making people hate their colleagues. Like, why on earth is this the way we're running offices? That meetings are the most remarkable pyramid sales scheme. It was that day at school that you missed. You went in and people said, you won't believe what happened. Sir fell over, Dave threw an apple, and you resolved, therefore, I'm never going to miss another day at school for the fear of missing out. We've got that when it comes to meetings. Even though we've attended hundreds of meetings where nothing good happens, we're convinced that the meetings, if you remember that first thing where you were promoted, and you got promoted, and you thought, good, at last I'm going to hear the good shit. And, you'd get a new notepad and you'd turn up for a meeting convinced at last the facts were going to be unearthed. And in fact, but far from it, you start looking at your boss thinking, he's going to the good meetings and he's left the bad meetings for me. But the truth of it is, there's no good meetings. And yet we've created this pyramid sales scheme where we're convinced the meetings we're not in are the ones where good shit happens. No, there's no good shit happening in any of the meetings. We've just got to slightly let go of the way we're working. Anyway, so that's what the book's about.
Thank you. Bruce, there's lots of things in your book that I like, but you talk about this kind of giving constant feedback as an important thing. And then the other thing I'd just like you to touch on is monk time.
So the one thing that you talk about there, so just studying all these things, and I think my take, I was interested in trying to understand good working cultures and good working dynamics, and albeit like a little bit of the book at the start talks about dealing with the burnout that we're all surrounded with. But the most elevated forms of work culture come from a combination of two things: positive affect, which is sort of the positive mood, and then psychological safety. And psychological safety is sort of what you're talking about there, the ability for someone to tell you the truth. And I heard psychological safety described in a couple of ways. It's either described as having the benefit of the doubt, your boss giving you the benefit of the doubt, but also the ability to speak truth to power. So, you know, if someone says that's a bad decision, that's a bad call, that's psychological safety. And, you know, the woman who's pioneered it has just recently updated her work and talked a lot about the VW Dieselgate affair and how there was an environment when the previous CEO there was really sort of renowned for never taking no for an answer. I think we've all been in environments where there's sort of hostility in the room and people probably would assert that they're trying to push us to greater feats. But if we're unable to admit that we can't do things, then there's an absence of psychological safety. And what you find is the best working environments, and I suspect very evidently in a client agency relationship, when there's psychological safety, when there's the ability to speak candidly to each other, I suspect the best relationships come from that. You mentioned monk mode, and I guess my book starts off with these sort of 12 interventions. If the world is permeated with burnout and exhaustion, and I think we all probably subjectively recognise a degree of that we feel overwhelmed by work. And I was just interested, I went to chat to one charity a few weeks ago, and they said to me, we tried to do a cultural reboot initiative last year, and we invited everyone along to the 3.5-hour kick-off meeting. and everyone declined. And for me, like, and that's the fundamental issue, because if you tell people who have just finished the marathon how they needed to do better, it's going to be less receptively received than when someone's, you know, in a better frame of mind. And monk mode, I think, is one of the most effective interventions that I've seen. I came upon it from a guy called Cal Newport, fascinating guy from Georgetown University, and he's really studied the way that we work, I think, in great depth. But he says monk mode morning is this idea that maybe twice a week you say for the first 90 minutes of the day, you're completely uncontactable. Most people say, the biggest survey of workers ever, said that people say they've had a good day at work when they've made progress in something meaningful. Pretty straightforward. All of this stuff is common sense. But monk mode just says for 90 minutes twice a week, you're just going to focus on one body of work with no interruptions, zero interruptions. It's often difficult. We're so used to interruptions now. Interruptions feel like the job. But just what you find is by having that 90 minutes of deep thought, deep work, you tend to exit that thinking, number one, I'm astonished what I've just accomplished. Yeah. But actually, there's a real joy in getting into a state of mental flow.
Tell me what else. What was the most surprising thing when you were doing your book?
Just that we've got into the norms of modern work, the way we've created it. I guess the thing I've been most taken with is the more you take just a brief glimpse at neuroscience. I often say if you were doing a GCSE neuroscience, but I'm going to say if you were doing an O-level for this one. If you were doing an O-level neuroscience, you'd split your brain into three categories. Like the executive attention network is you focusing on stuff. It's you sort of sitting there with your pen or focused on your laptop. The salience network runs background predictions. So it's running all the time. It runs background predictions in your brain of what's going on in this room. It's sort of predicting what's going on. And the third overall network in your brain is something called the default mode or the default network. And the really interesting thing is that most people, when they have creative ideas, they're normally activating this default mode. So the way that neuroscientists observe this is they'll put someone in an fMRI brain scanner, they give them something to do, and then watch what happens when they stop doing it. So the default mode is us in daydream mode. I was chatting to someone the other day, and they said, yeah, I get all my best ideas when I'm walking the dog. Or someone said to me they had their best ideas on the loo. And, but my favourite example of it is that the screenwriter Aaron Sorkin, the guy who wrote The West Wing and he wrote the Social Network film, he realised he was having his best ideas not frowning into his laptop, but in the shower. So he had a shower installed in the corner of his office, and he says he has 8 to 10 showers a day. But the really interesting thing is, I challenge you this, and I work at one of these products, so I recognise it. The whole of digital media largely is built on filling the gaps between things, right? You know, it used to be that when you're in the queue at M&S, you would stand there bored, annoyed with the person in front. Now you get your phone out your pocket. When you're standing for a lift, you used to stand there jiggling the button. Used to be the thing you did. Now you get your phone out your pocket. And the really interesting thing is that actually, if you look at where people have their creative ideas, they often have their creative ideas when they're in that sort of in-between daydreaming mode. And there's a danger, actually, that if you look at most people's calendars at work, they're heavily scheduled. And those moments you stumble from the heavily scheduled meetings into doing emails, and there's no gaps between things. And once you recognise that ideas live in the gaps between things, that ideas live in those moments of boredom, staring out the window, then the fact that we've eradicated them and all of the digital products that I'm responsible for and everyone else.
It's your fault.
But we've eradicated boredom, and actually boredom seems to be, in hindsight, as we're looking back, it seems to be one of these magical things that we've maybe underestimated the power of it. So I think that's it. You know, now we're all guilty of this. Someone described it best to me. We're all guilty of. A guy said to me, he said, I think I'm one of the good guys, but inside of me is an 18th century mill owner. And he says, when people aren't at their desk at 9 o'clock, I'm like, where are they? You know, like this sort of something. But we've all got that inner mill owner inside us. Now, I guarantee, if you open someone's calendar tomorrow and you notice they have no meetings, you'll immediately say, you're not doing anything. You're like, we've got this sense in our head that somehow people without meetings are being indolent. We're so convinced that meetings are now work, whereas, of course, it's not the case. So I think reminding ourselves that ideas live in the gaps between things. Ideas live in daydreaming. I think, you know, that for me was a real fascination, discovering that actually, you know, the old adage, everything I've discovered is common sense, but the old adage, beware the busy manager, is never more true.